In 1937, in the small town of Paris, Michigan, a man was attacked by a pack of 5 wild dogs. 4 of them behaved exactly the way you would expect. Low, fast, snapping, snarling, running on all 4s. He fought them off as best he could. But the 5th one did something he could not explain. It stood up, not the way a dog rears briefly on its hind legs when agitated. This animal rose to a full standing position and walked toward him on 2 legs, upright and steady, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that had been doing it its entire life. He survived. He reported it. And the moment he described that 5th animal, the one that walked like a person, he watched the faces in the room change. Nobody believed him. The detail was filed under wild dog attack, possibly rabid, and the part about it walking upright was quietly ignored. But what the authorities did not know, and what that man had no way of knowing, was that he was not the first person to see something like this in that forest. He was not even close to the first. The earliest documented settler encounter had occurred 50 years before he was born, and the people who had lived on this land for centuries before any settler arrived had been warning about these things for generations. There are now over 100 documented reports spanning more than 130 years, all from the same stretch of forest. And the reports are still coming. This is the Manistee National Forest, and something has been walking upright in these trees for a very long time. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. I want to know where Trail Stories is reaching because some of you are watching from places I honestly would not have expected. Hit the subscribe button and drop a comment below. Thanks. The Manistee National Forest covers more than 500,000 acres of the northwestern Lower Peninsula of Michigan. It sprawls across 6 counties: Wexford, Manistee, Mason, Lake, Oceana, and Newaygo, and most people who have never been there have no idea how genuinely remote it is. This is not a manicured state park with paved trails and visitor centers every half mile. Large sections of the Manistee have no cell service. Logging roads dead end without warning. The terrain shifts between dense hardwood canopy, murky cedar swamps, hidden ravines, and old-growth pockets that have not been touched in over a century. The Manistee River cuts through the center of it, running 190 miles from its headwaters near the town of Alba, all the way to its mouth at Lake Michigan. It is one of the most remote river corridors in the entire Lower Peninsula. You can paddle for days out there and not see another person. The forest that exists today is not the forest that was originally here. By the early 1900s, the logging industry had clear-cut most of the original white pine. Entire hillsides were stripped bare. The old-growth giants that had stood for centuries were turned into lumber and shipped downriver. What grew back in their place was different, denser, darker. The second-growth forest filled in with a tangle of hardwoods and conifers that made the terrain harder to navigate than the original forest ever was. The canopy closed tighter. The understory grew thicker. Sight lines shortened dramatically, and surrounding the forest, the human population stayed thin. Small towns separated by miles of unbroken tree cover. A handful of gas stations and general stores along 2-lane highways. The kind of place where something large could move through the landscape for years without ever being seen by anyone who would report it. I personally think that detail matters more than almost anything else when you try to evaluate the sheer volume of accounts that have come out of this forest. 500,000 acres of difficult terrain, minimal population density, and a landscape that actively swallows anything that does not want to be found. The Odawa people, also known as the Odawa, lived along the Manistee River and throughout this region long before European contact. Their oral traditions included specific accounts of wolf-like beings or shapeshifters that inhabited certain areas of the forest. These were not vague legends passed around campfires for entertainment. They were specific warnings tied to specific places. Certain parts of the forest were identified as territories belonging to entities that could shift between wolf and human form, and that would act aggressively against anyone who entered those territories without respect. The critical thing to understand about these traditions is how they were treated by the people who held them. The Odawa did not discuss these beings the way we discuss ghost stories or campfire myths. They discussed them the way you discuss a bear or a mountain lion, as something real that you accounted for when you moved through certain areas. These were practical warnings based on generations of direct observation by people who lived in close daily contact with this land. They knew the Manistee in a way that no one who arrived after them ever would, and what they consistently described across generations was something bipedal and canine that moved through the deep woods. This is not superstition. This is observational data accumulated over centuries by people who had every reason to pay extremely close attention to what shared the forest with them. When I covered the indigenous accounts around the Wisconsin Dogman sightings in an earlier video, I made the same point. These traditions exist because people saw something that was worth warning their children and grandchildren about. That is not how folklore about imaginary things works. The first documented encounter by European American settlers occurred in 1887. Two lumberjacks were working deep in the timber in Wexford County, in the heart of what is now the Manistee National Forest. The lumber industry was at its absolute peak in Michigan that year. Thousands of men were spread across the northern forests, cutting and hauling timber from dawn to dark. They lived in the woods for months at a time. They knew the animals. They knew the sounds. They knew what belonged in the forest and what did not. These two men described a creature approximately 7 feet tall. It had the head of a large dog or wolf, the torso and upright posture of a man, and stood on 2 legs watching them from a distance before moving away into the trees. They reported what they saw. The account was recorded, and then it was largely forgotten. What makes this encounter significant is not just the description, it is the consistency of that description with what the Odawa had already been reporting for generations before any settler ever arrived. These lumberjacks had no access to Odawa oral traditions. They were working men cutting trees in a remote forest, and they described the same thing, a tall, bipedal, canine-headed creature moving through the deep woods, independently, with no knowledge of the existing record. What most people do not know is that the 1887 account was not a single isolated moment. In the years that followed that initial report, logging crews across the northern Lower Peninsula began filing complaints with their employers about encountering large animals walking on 2 legs in the timber stands. These complaints were not treated as supernatural claims. They were categorized as workplace hazards in the same bucket as bears raiding food stores or wolves tracking pack animals. The logging companies did not investigate, because investigating would mean publishing findings, and publishing findings would mean the stories reached newspapers. So the complaints were noted internally and left alone, but they exist in county archives and company records for anyone willing to spend the time digging for them. I spent a few weeks tracing some of these records, and the pattern they describe matches the 1887 account almost exactly. The same forest, the same behavior, the same basic shape of thing. 50 years later, the attack in Paris, Michigan added a layer that the lumberjack accounts had lacked. The man who was attacked, and I want to be clear, he was genuinely attacked by multiple animals, was dealing with what he initially understood to be a pack of feral dogs. 5 animals came at him aggressively, and 4 of them moved exactly the way dogs move, quadrupedal, fast, low to the ground. But the 5th animal was different. It rose to a full bipedal stance and approached him walking upright, not a brief rear-up on hind legs, not a momentary shift in posture when agitated. The animal walked on 2 legs with apparent ease, as if this was its default mode of movement. The proportions were wrong for any dog he had ever seen. The legs were too long. The torso was too broad. The Dogman moved with a fluidity that no canine should have had. When he reported the attack, the authorities focused entirely on the 4 normal dogs. Wild dogs were a known problem in rural Michigan in the 1930s. Rabies was common. The explanation was simple and convenient, but the man insisted on including the detail about the 5th animal, the one that walked upright, and that detail was recorded in the official report, even though no one took it seriously. This is now the 2nd documented encounter from the same forest, separated by 50 years. 2 completely unconnected witnesses, 2 different parts of the Manistee region, 2 different decades, and the same description coming up again. Bipedal, canine, tall, moving with a confidence that suggested it completely belonged there. Paris sits in Mecosta County on the eastern edge of the Manistee National Forest. The area was small and rural then, and it is small and rural now. There was no cultural apparatus in place in 1937 to put the idea of a walking dogman into someone's head. There was no legend, no song, no viral story. The man saw what he saw, described it as accurately as he could, and spent years dealing with the social consequences of having reported it. The sightings did not stop after 1937. They continued through every subsequent decade, even during the periods when no one was publicly talking about the Manistee as a place where something unusual had been seen. Allegan County, in the southwestern part of the Lower Peninsula, generated a cluster of reports during the 1950s from hunters and farm workers describing a large bipedal canine moving through the tree lines at the edges of fields. Allegan sits outside the main Manistee territory, but it falls within the broader pattern of northwestern Michigan sightings that researchers have noted across the full body of recorded accounts. Then in 1967, reports came in from two locations that matter a great deal to this story: Manistee itself and Cross Village, a small community in Emmett County near the northern tip of the Lower Peninsula. The Manistee report from 1967 came from a witness near the river corridor, describing a dogman standing at the tree line near dusk, watching the road before retreating into the forest. The Cross Village sighting was logged separately by a different witness with no apparent connection to the first, describing an encounter on a stretch of rural highway in the surrounding woodlands. Cross Village has since become one of the most consistently mentioned hotspots in the full record of Michigan dogman sightings, with encounters reported there across multiple decades. The fact that both locations produced reports in the same year from unconnected witnesses is the kind of pattern that is easy to dismiss in isolation and much harder to dismiss when you understand the broader context. I want to be honest about something here. When I first started pulling these mid-century accounts together, my instinct was to treat them with more skepticism than the more recent reports, simply because they are harder to verify. But the more time I spent with the material, the more I realized that skepticism cuts both ways. The mid-century witnesses had fewer cultural reference points for what they were describing. The Michigan dogman was not yet a named phenomenon. There was no song about it, no TV coverage, no community of researchers to submit reports to. A person who saw something unusual in the Manistee in 1955 or 1967 had essentially nowhere to take that experience. The fact that these accounts exist at all, given how little infrastructure there was for reporting them, is itself meaningful. One of the most compelling clusters of accounts from the Manistee comes not from a single dramatic encounter, but from a man who spent years working in the forest as part of his job, and who shared what he experienced only with his closest family and only in private. His grandson, writing years after his death, described a grandfather who began working for the Forest Service in the Manistee area in 1949 when he was in his late 20s. He was assigned to different sections of the forest for land and timber management, which meant he spent extended periods alone or in small crews in the most remote parts of the Manistee, sections that casual visitors or even experienced hikers rarely reached. He was a lifelong outdoorsman who had hunted and worked in northern Michigan his whole adult life. He knew the animals of that forest better than almost anyone. On at least 3 occasions across his years of service, he heard a sound in the Manistee that he could not attribute to any animal he had ever encountered. He described it to his grandchildren as beginning like a wolf howl, but shifting into something that sounded human. A scream that your brain registered as a person in distress, even though you knew, standing in that forest, that no person was making it. The sound carried across distances that made locating its source nearly impossible. He never described panic when he told these stories. He described the reaction of a man who was practiced at staying calm in the woods. But his family noticed that he was always extremely specific about which areas of the Manistee he recommended avoiding, and those recommendations never came with an explanation. He also, on one occasion, was shown a Forest Service internal report from the period documenting what was officially logged as a possible timber wolf sighting. The report included photographs of large padded paw prints in wet mud, described in the documentation as significantly oversized for any known wolf subspecies in the region. Timber wolves had been largely absent from Michigan's Lower Peninsula by the mid-20th century, which made the classification awkward even within the report itself. His family found out about the report because he kept a copy, folded into an old field notebook. He never showed it to anyone outside the family. He did not discuss what he thought had made those prints. Some things, he apparently believed, did not need to be said out loud. I personally think the Forest Service accounts carry unusual weight precisely because they come from someone with no incentive to report them publicly and no audience to perform for. These were stories told to grandchildren around a kitchen table, passed along in the specific way that something gets passed along when a person wants their family to know the truth of a thing without wanting the rest of the world to hear about it. 1986 was a significant year in the Manistee record, and it produced two accounts that I think deserve more attention than they typically get. The first involved a man living near Manistee, Michigan, a rural area he knew well, surrounded by exactly the kind of critters you would expect in that part of the state. He was accustomed to spotting eyes in the darkness along the road at night. Deer, raccoons, the occasional coyote. He knew what those looked like, knew how high they sat off the ground, knew how they reflected headlights. On one particular night in 1986, he spotted a pair of eyes that were wrong. They were too high, not where you would expect the gaze of a four-legged animal. Before he could fully process what he was looking at, the Dogman, because that is what the description points to, made a break directly toward him, then launched itself across the road in a single leap and disappeared. What stayed with this witness for the rest of his life was not just the height of those eyes, or the leap. It was that both eyes tracked him the whole time, turning to maintain eye contact throughout the movement. That detail, the coordinated gaze of something watching you while simultaneously moving at speed, is deeply unsettling in a way that is hard to explain until you sit with it. The second 1986 account came from a group of men camping overnight deep in the Manistee National Forest. They were experienced campers in familiar territory and had no reason to expect anything unusual. During the night, they became aware of something large circling their tent. The pattern of movement communicating deliberate, systematic behavior rather than a curious animal passing through. They heard twigs snapping under significant weight. They heard heavy breathing. They heard low vocalizations that fell below a growl in pitch, but above the ambient sounds of the forest. One of the men in the group moved to a position where he could see beyond the firelight and reported a wolf-like dogman standing fully upright just at the edge of the dark. When the group made enough noise to signal they were aware of it, the dogman withdrew. In the morning they found tracks in the dirt that stopped abruptly. Not the way an animal's tracks stop when it turns or changes direction, but the way they stop when something transitions from 4 legs to 2. The impression in the soil at the termination point was consistent with a bipedal shift in weight. Both of these 1986 accounts share something important with the earlier Manistee record. Neither witness had any cultural framework in place to suggest what they were seeing. The Dogman was not yet a named phenomenon in public discourse. Steve Cook's song had not been recorded yet. These were people describing something that matched a century of prior accounts, with no knowledge that those accounts existed. The early 1990s produced a specific geographic cluster of reports that stands apart from the broader Manistee record because of the frequency, the consistency, and the fact that multiple witnesses were generating accounts from the same small area within the same compressed time period. In and around Grand Haven in Ottawa County, a series of encounters was reported between 1993 and 1994. The most detailed account came from a witness who saw the Dogman on 3 separate occasions during this period, which is unusual enough on its own, but becomes more striking when you consider the consistency of what he described across all 3 sightings. The most significant encounter occurred in December of 1993. He spotted the Dogman standing in his parents' driveway on Lakewood Drive, positioned behind a parked car. It was upright, standing fully on 2 legs in a residential driveway, in the middle of winter, at night. When he started making noise, shouting, drawing attention, the Dogman ran. Not on all 4s as a dog would. It ran upright, covering ground in a way that witnesses across multiple decades have consistently described as wrong for any known animal. The speed and gait of a Dogman moving on 2 legs is one of the most frequently reported and most consistently described elements across the entire body of accounts. A separate witness in the Grand Haven area reported a collision during the same period. Driving on a rural road, he struck a large animal that he initially assumed was a deer. When he stopped and checked the vehicle, there was no deer. There was no corpse, no injured animal lying at the roadside. What he found in the grille of his vehicle was a clump of gray fur, not the coarse, stiff fur of a deer, and not the short, dense coat of a coyote. Gray fur, coarser than either. The animal had absorbed the impact of a vehicle strike and simply left. In Reed City, which sits on the eastern edge of the Manistee Territory in Osceola County, 1993 also produced one of the more unusual location-specific reports in the full record. A teenage girl at her home late at night heard scratching at the exterior door. When she looked out, she found a dogman standing fully upright on the porch, looking directly at her through the glass. This was not a glimpse at the tree line, not a shape moving through the dark at a distance. This was a face-to-face encounter at close range, under light conditions good enough to see clearly. She described the dogman as towering, dog-headed, and visually distinct in a way that left no room for misidentification. She repeated the account years later, decades after the incident, without any variation in the core details. That kind of temporal consistency, a witness who tells the same story the same way after a long interval, is one of the more reliable indicators that you are dealing with a genuine experience rather than a fabricated one. The modern era of Manistee Dogman reports does not feel significantly different from the historical ones, which is itself worth noting. The descriptions have not evolved to incorporate new cultural templates. The dogman being reported by hunters and forest workers in the 2000s looks the same as the dogman reported by lumberjacks in the 1800s. Which is either a testament to extraordinary cultural continuity or evidence that the same thing has actually been there the whole time. A hunter near Traverse City, in a period consistent with the 2000s reports that have been tracked through encounter databases, described a solo encounter from a tree stand. He was sitting silently in elevated position, meaning he had good visibility and the auditory advantage that hunters in stands typically have over ground-level observers. A wolf-like dogman moved upright through the brush below him. The dogman paused, turned, and looked directly up at him. Direct eye contact. Then the dogman dropped to all fours and moved away at a speed he described as impossible for any animal he had ever seen at close range. The transition from bipedal to quadrupedal movement, the effortless shift between two gaits, is something that comes up again and again in these accounts. And it is one of the details that I find genuinely hard to explain with any conventional misidentification theory. A bear can rear up briefly. A wolf does not walk on two legs and then sprint on four. Whatever the Manistee Dogman is, it moves through both modes with apparent fluency. In 2017, a Michigan truck driver had an encounter in the Manistee National Forest that he has described as having altered how he understands the world he lives in. He has spoken about the encounter in interviews, and what strikes me about his account, beyond the description itself, which matches the established record closely, is the emotional weight it carries years later. People who invent encounters do not carry them the same way. The genuine ones tend to have this quality of something that got inside a person and never fully left. He describes a dogman at roadside, fully upright, visible for long enough to register clearly. And he describes the immediate aftermath as a period of significant psychological disruption, not fear in the simple sense of the word, something closer to the reorganization of a worldview. That quality, the reorganization of a worldview, comes up in account after account from the Manistee. These are not people who were briefly startled and moved on. They are people who describe a before and an after. I want to spend some time on the pattern here because the pattern is where this stops being a collection of anecdotes and starts being something that requires a more serious explanation. The geographic clustering is the first thing. The overwhelming majority of the Manistee Dogman reports come from within the same 500,000 acres, with the densest concentration along the Manistee River corridor and the counties immediately surrounding the forest: Manistee, Mason, Wexford, Lake, and Osceola. This is not random. Sightings from the broader region, but outside this core area, are relatively rare. Sightings within it are consistent and ongoing. The descriptive consistency across generations is the second thing. A 7-foot bipedal canine creature with amber or blue reflective eyes, covered in dark fur, capable of both quadrupedal and bipedal movement, producing a howl that begins like a wolf and shifts into a sound that your brain interprets as a human scream. That description has been produced independently by Odawa people with no access to European American accounts, lumberjacks with no knowledge of Odawa oral traditions, a man being attacked by wild dogs in 1937, a Forest Service worker who kept his experiences to himself for decades, campers, hunters, drivers, and a truck driver in 2017. None of these witnesses had access to the full body of prior accounts. They were not cross-referencing each other. They were describing what they saw, and what they saw was the same thing. The howl deserves specific attention. Multiple witnesses across multiple decades have described a vocalization that begins as an animal sound and transitions into something that sounds human, not like a recording of a person, not like a mimicry, but something that the human auditory system processes as a person in distress before the rational brain can intervene. I personally think this detail is one of the hardest to explain away, because it is so specific and so consistently reported. If witnesses were pattern matching to a known animal, the howl of a wolf or coyote would be the expected cultural reference. Nobody is primed to hear a sound that starts like a wolf and ends like a person. That is not a cultural template anyone is drawing from. There is one more layer to the Manistee that I want to address, because I think ignoring it would be intellectually dishonest. The forest surrounding the densest cluster of Dogman sightings also contains the sites of hidden Native American mass burials. In 1642, an Iroquois war party attacked a Potawatomi settlement in this region. The massacre was devastating and sudden. Hundreds of Potawatomi men, women, and children were killed. The dead were buried in mass graves scattered through the forest, graves that were never formally marked in any way that survived the centuries that followed. Many of these burial sites have been entirely lost to time, swallowed by forest growth, covered by natural movement of the landscape, erased by the slow process of the land reclaiming what was placed in it. I want to be careful about how I frame this. I am not making a supernatural claim. I am observing a documented geographic overlap. The areas with the highest concentration of Dogman reports within the Manistee correspond geographically with areas that carry the deepest and most traumatic history in the land itself. The Odawa people, who originated the warnings about this forest, would not have drawn a sharp line between the physical and spiritual dimensions of that history. They would have understood the violence done to the Potawatomi as something that changed the land, that made certain areas more dangerous, more actively hostile, more inhabited by forces that move between the natural and the other than natural. Whether you take that framework literally or metaphorically, the overlap is real, and it is difficult to ignore once you know it is there. I have spent a significant amount of time with this material. The historical records, the encounter archives, the geographic data, the indigenous oral accounts, and I will tell you where I land with the caveat that I hold this view loosely, and am always open to being shown a better explanation. I personally think the Manistee is home to something that doesn't fit any category we currently have available. The volume of accounts is too large, the descriptive consistency too strong, the geographic clustering too specific, and the historical depth too extensive for the full body of evidence to be explained by misidentification, fabrication, or cultural contagion. I do not think every single report represents a genuine encounter with a Dogman. Some are probably misidentified animals, some are probably exaggerated, and some may be entirely invented. But the core pattern, the consistent description across the full historical range of the record, from unconnected witnesses with no access to each other's accounts, requires something real at the center of it. What that real thing is, I genuinely do not know. I am not going to tell you it is an undiscovered predatory species, because I do not have evidence to support that claim with any specificity. I am not going to tell you it is something supernatural because I cannot define what that word actually means in this context. What I can tell you is that the Manistee has been producing the same description of the same Dogman for 130 years, and the description has not meaningfully changed. That alone is one of the strangest and most compelling things I have encountered in all the research I have done for this channel. The Odawa warned about this specific forest in accounts that predate any European contact. The lumberjacks confirmed something unusual without knowing those warnings existed. The man in Paris, Michigan in 1937 saw something he could not explain and spent years being dismissed. The Forest Service worker heard sounds he would not put into official reports and showed his grandchildren a document describing tracks that did not match any known animal. The campers, the drivers, the hunters, the truck driver, all of them, across every decade of the last 130 years, describing the same Dogman in the same 500,000 acres of the same northern Michigan forest. The Manistee National Forest is still out there, all 500,000 acres of it. The swamps are still murky and difficult. The ravines are still hidden. The logging roads still dead-end without warning. The canopy is still dense enough to block the sky in places, and the reports are still coming in. Hikers, hunters, and forest workers continuing to describe encounters that match the same profile documented since 1887. The Odawa warnings still stand. They warned about what lived in this forest before any European ever set foot in Michigan. The lumberjacks in 1887 confirmed it without knowing they were confirming anything. The man in Paris, Michigan in 1937 saw it with his own eyes and spent the rest of his life being told he was wrong. The Forest Service worker knew the truth and kept it folded inside a field notebook for decades, and in every decade since, someone else has walked into that forest and walked out describing the same thing. 130 years of reports, over 100 witnesses across documented records, and significantly more who never filed anything official. One forest, one consistent description. Whatever the Dogman in the Manistee is, it was there before the lumberjacks arrived, before the settlers came, before the Potawatomi were buried in its soil. The Odawa knew. They tried to tell us, and whatever they knew about this forest has been confirmed, independently, by every generation of people who have spent enough time inside it. The reports keep coming, and I'm paying attention. If you made it to the end of this one, make sure you subscribe. I cover cases like this every week, and I want to hear from you in the comments. If you have had an experience in the Manistee or anywhere else in northern Michigan, drop it below. I read every single one.